Modern Money Primer blog number 34, Functional Finance and Exchange Rate Regimes, The Twin Deficits Debate, by L. Randall Wray. In the previous weeks, we examined the functional finance approach of Abba Lerner. It is clear that Lerner was analyzing the case of a country with a sovereign currency, or what many call fiat currency. Only the sovereign government can choose to spend more whenever unemployment exists, and only the sovereign government can increase bank reserves and lower short-term interest rates to the target level. It is important to note that Lerner was writing as the Bretton Woods system was being created, a system of fixed exchange rates based on the dollar. Thus it would appear that he meant for his functional finance approach to apply to the case of a sovereign currency regardless of exchange rate regime chosen. Still, it must be remembered that all countries in Lerner's time adopted strict capital controls. In terms of the trilemma, they had a fixed exchange rate and domestic policy independence, but did not allow free capital flows. We have seen that domestic policy space is greatest in the case of a floating currency, but that adopting capital controls in combination with a managed or fixed exchange rate can still preserve substantial domestic policy space. That is probably what Lerner had in mind. Most countries with fixed exchange rates and free capital mobility would not be able to pursue Lerner's two principles of functional finance because their foreign currency reserves would be threatened. Only a handful of nations have amassed so many reserves that their position is unassailable. Managed or fixed exchange rates with some degree of constraint on capital flows can provide the required domestic policy space to pursue a full employment goal. We conclude the two principles of functional finance apply most directly to a sovereign nation operating with a floating currency. If the currency is pegged, then the policy space is more constrained, and the nation might have to adopt capital controls to protect its international reserves in order to maintain confidence in its peg. The U.S. Twin Deficits Debate. Deficit hawks in the U.S. frequently raise three objections to persistent national government budget deficits. A. They oppose a solvency risk that could force government to default on its debt. B. They pose an inflation or even a hyperinflation risk. And C. They impose a burden on our grandkids who will have to pay interest in perpetuity to the Chinese, who are accumulating U.S. Treasuries as well as power over the fate of the dollar. This often leads to the claim that the U.S. dollar is in danger of losing its status as international reserve currency. We have seen that national budget deficits and debts do not matter so far as national solvency goes. The sovereign issuer of the currency cannot be forced into an involuntary default. We also have dealt with possible inflation effects of deficit spending. More on that later. To summarize that argument as briefly as possible, additional deficit spending beyond the point of full employment will almost certainly be inflationary, and inflation barriers can be reached even before full employment. However, the risk of hyperinflation for a sovereign country like the U.S. is low. Later, we will address the connection among budget deficits, trade deficits, and foreign accumulation of treasuries, the interest burden supposedly imposed on our grandkids, and the possibility that foreign holders might decide to abandon the dollar. Let us set out the framework thoroughly examined in previous blogs. At the aggregate level, the government's deficit equals the non-government sector's surplus. We can break the non-government sector into a domestic component and a foreign component. As the U.S. macro-sectoral balance identity shows, the government sector deficit equals the sum of the domestic private sector surplus plus the current account deficit, which is the foreign sector surplus. We will put to the side discussion about the behaviors that got the U.S. to the current reality, which is a large federal budget deficit that is equal to a large private sector surplus, spending less than income. plus a rather large current account deficit, mostly resulting from a U.S. trade balance in which imports exceed exports. There is a positive relation between budget deficits and the current account deficit that goes behind the identity. All else equal, a government budget deficit raises aggregate demand so that U.S. imports exceed U.S. exports. American consumers are able to buy more imports because the U.S. fiscal stance generates household income used to buy foreign output that exceeds foreign purchases of U.S. output. There are other possible avenues that can generate a relation between a government deficit and a current account deficit. Some point to effects on interest rates and exchange rates, but they are at best of secondary importance, if not wrong. To sum up, a U.S. government deficit can prop up demand for output, some of which is produced outside the U.S., so that U.S. imports rise more than exports, especially when a budget deficit stimulates the American economy to grow faster than the economies of our trading partners. When foreign nations run trade surpluses and the U.S. runs a trade deficit, they are able to accumulate dollar-denominated assets. A foreign firm that receives dollars usually exchanges them for domestic currency at its central bank. For this reason, a large proportion of the dollar claims on the U.S. end up at foreign central banks. Since international payments are made through banks, rather than by actually delivering U.S. Federal Reserve paper notes, the dollars accumulated in foreign central banks are in the form of reserves held at the Fed. Nothing but electronic entries on the Fed's balance sheet. These reserves held by foreigners, mostly central banks, do not earn interest. Since the central banks would prefer to earn interest, they convert them to U.S. Treasuries, which are really just another electronic entry on the Fed's balance sheet, albeit one that periodically gets credited with interest. This conversion from reserves to treasuries is akin to shifting funds from your checking account to a certificate of deposit, CD, at your bank, with the interest paid through a simple keystroke that increases the size of your deposit. Likewise, treasuries are CDs that get credited interest through Fed keystrokes. In sum, a U.S. current account deficit will be reflected in foreign accumulation of U.S. treasuries, held mostly by foreign central banks. You can see the evidence here in figures 2 and 3. While this is usually presented as foreign lending to finance the U.S. budget deficit, one could just as well see the U.S. current account deficit as the source of foreign current account surpluses that can be accumulated as treasuries. In a sense, it is the proclivity of the U.S. to simultaneously run trade and government budget deficits that provides the wherewithal to finance foreign accumulation of U.S. treasuries. Obviously, there must be a willingness on all sides for this to occur. We could say that it takes at least two to tango, and most public decision ignores the fact that the Chinese desire to run a trade surplus with the U.S. is linked to its desire to accumulate dollar assets. At the same time, the U.S. budget deficit helps to generate domestic income that allows our private sector to consume, some of which fuels imports, providing the income foreigners use to accumulate dollar saving, even as it generates treasuries accumulated by foreigners. In other words, the decisions cannot be independent. It makes no sense to talk of Chinese lending to the U.S. without also taking account of Chinese desires to net export. Indeed, all of the following are linked, possibly in complex ways: the willingness of Chinese to produce for export, the willingness of China to accumulate U.S. dollar-denominated assets, the shortfall of Chinese domestic demand that allows China to run a trade surplus, the willingness of Americans to buy foreign products, the relatively high level of U.S. aggregate demand that results in a trade deficit, and the factors that result in a U.S. government budget deficit. And of course, it is even more complicated than this because we must bring in other nations as well as global demand taken as a whole. While it is often claimed that the Chinese might suddenly decide they do not want U.S. Treasuries any longer, at least one, but more likely many of these other relationships would also need to change. For example, it is feared that China might decide it would rather accumulate euros. However, there is no equivalent to the U.S. Treasury in Euroland. China could accumulate the euro-denominated debt of individual governments, say Greece, but these have different risk ratings, and the sheer volume issued by any individual nation is likely too small to satisfy China's desire to accumulate foreign currency reserves. Further, Euroland, taken as a whole, and this is especially true of its strongest member, Germany, attempts to constrain domestic demand to avoid trade deficits, meaning it is hard for the rest of the world to accumulate euro claims against Euroland, does not generally run trade deficits. If the U.S. is a primary market for China's excess output, but euro assets are preferred over dollar assets, then exchange rate adjustment between the relatively plentiful dollar and relatively scarce euro could destroy China's market for its exports. This should not be interpreted as an argument that the current situation will go on forever, although it could persist much longer than most commentators presume. But changes are complex, and there are strong incentives against the sort of simple, abrupt, and dramatic shifts often positive as likely scenarios. The complexity as well as the linkages among balance sheets ensure that transitions will be moderate and slow. There will be no sudden dumping of U.S. Treasuries that would destroy the value of the financial wealth held by the Chinese, as well as the export market they currently rely upon. Before concluding, let us do a thought experiment to drive home a key point. The greatest fear that many have over foreign ownership of U.S. Treasuries is the burden on America's grandkids, who it is believed will have to pay interest to foreigners. Unlike domestically held treasuries, this is said to be a transfer from some American taxpayer to a foreign bondholder. When bonds are held by Americans, the transfer is from an American taxpayer to an American bondholder, believed to be less problematic. So, it is argued, government debt really does burden future generations because a portion is held by foreigners now. In reality, interest is paid by keystrokes, but our grandkids might decide to raise taxes on themselves to match interest paid to Chinese bondholders and thereby impose the burden feared by deficit hawks. So let us continue with our hypothetical case. What if the U.S. managed to eliminate its trade deficit so that it ran a perpetually balanced current account? In that case, the U.S. budget deficit would exactly equal the U.S. private sector surplus. Since foreigners would not be accumulating dollars in their trade with the U.S., they could not accumulate U.S. treasuries. Yes, they could trade for foreign currencies for the dollar, but this would cause the dollar to appreciate in a manner that would make balanced trade difficult to maintain. In that case, no matter how large the budget deficit, the U.S. would not need to borrow from the Chinese to finance it. This makes it clear that foreign finance of our budget deficit is contingent on our current account balance. Foreigners need to export to us so that they can lend to our government. And if our current account is in balance, then no matter how big our government budget deficit, we will not need foreign savings to finance it, because our domestic private sector surplus will be exactly equal to our government deficit. Indeed, one could quite reasonably say that it is the budget deficit that finances domestic private sector saving. Yes, the deficit hawks believe the federal budget deficit would be more sustainable if foreigners did not accumulate treasuries that supposedly burden future generations of Americans. But how could the U.S. eliminate the current account deficit that allows foreigners to accumulate treasuries? The IMF-approved method of balancing trade is to impose austerity. If the U.S. were to grow much slower than our trading partners, U.S. imports would fall and exports would rise. In fact, The Great Recession that began in the U.S. in 2007 did reduce the trade deficit, although only moderately and probably temporarily. In order to eliminate the trade deficit and to ensure that the U.S. runs balanced trade, it might need a much deeper and permanent recession. By reducing American living standards relative to those enjoyed by the rest of the world, the nation might be able to eliminate its current account deficit and thereby ensure that foreigners do not accumulate treasuries said to burden future generations of Americans. Now, can the deficit hawks please explain why Americans should desire permanently lower living standards on their promise that this will somehow reduce the burden on the nation's grandkids? It seems rather obvious that grandkids would prefer a higher growth path both now and in the future, so that America can leave them with a stronger economy and higher living standards. If that means that 30 years from now the Fed will need to stroke a few keys to add interest to Chinese deposits, so be it. And if the Chinese someday decide to use dollars to buy imports, America's grandkids will be better suited to produce the stuff the Chinese want to buy. In conclusion, while there are links between the twin deficits, they are not the links usually imagined. U.S. trade and budget deficits are linked, but they do not put the U.S. in an unsustainable position vis-a-vis the Chinese. If the Chinese and other net exporters, such as Japan, decide they prefer fewer dollar assets, this will be linked to a desire to sell fewer products to America. This is a particularly likely scenario for the Chinese, who are rapidly developing their economy and creating a nation of consumers. But the transition will not be abrupt. The U.S. current account deficit with China will shrink, just as its sales of U.S. government bonds to Chinese to offer an interest-paying substitute to reserves at the Fed decline. This will not result in a crisis. The U.S. government does not, indeed cannot, borrow dollars from the Chinese to finance deficit spending. Rather, U.S. current account deficits provide the dollars used by the Chinese to buy the safest dollar asset in the world, U.S. Treasuries. To be clear, the U.S. dollar probably will not remain the world's reserve currency. From the U.S. perspective, that might be a disappointment. In the long view of history, it is inconsequential. There is little doubt that China will become the world's biggest economy. Its currency is a likely candidate for international currency reserve, but that is not a foregone conclusion, nor something to be feared.